Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here today. It's not lost on me how much effort it takes to spend a full hour just devoting yourself to learning and looking at new data and new research and generating new ideas to grow your fundraising. So we're going to try not to waste a moment of your time today. I do have a few housekeeping items I want to address up front, but a few shout outs here. Welcome, Glenn. Welcome, Patty from South Texas. Hope you're staying safe with the impending hurricanes coming. Ricky from San Francisco, welcome. We've got a bunch more people slowly trickling in here. We'll have a great session today, I think. The most common question that we get from these webinars is, number one, is there going to be a recording? The answer is absolutely yes. We are recording this right now. We will send you the recording later this evening, so you'll be able to watch that back, share it with other colleagues, share it with other people around the industry who might benefit from this research and this data. Now, number two, along with the recording, we're going to send you some links to the slide deck as well as any other resources that we mentioned throughout the webinar today. So you'll have links to all those. If you're trying to take copious notes, don't worry too much. We'll give you those links a little bit later. And then number three, we will have some time at the end for some additional Q&A. So as we're going through the data, through the research about higher ed fundraising, make sure that you use the chat window on the right side of your screen. You can just pop your ideas in there, your thoughts in there. If there's a question that comes up about a specific data point or maybe an overarching question about the research or what it means for you, feel free to put those in the chat window. I'll be watching those throughout, and then we'll be able to ask those questions directly to Brady at the very end of our session today. One other thing I want you to know about that's coming up at the end of September is the NIO Summit, Nonprofit Innovation and Optimization Summit. It's entirely virtual this year. It's 2 days, 16 plus speakers, one of these on-demand learning labs where you can actually get real-time feedback on your campaigns and donation pages and email fundraising. There's virtual networking opportunities, and it's going to be a blast. We love NEO Summit. We desperately wish that we could be in person. We're going to try to make this the best virtual experience that you've ever had at a nonprofit event. There's some really cool speakers, including Dan Pallotta. You probably know his name. Jen Shang, Reggie Rivers, who's a former Denver Bronco and does event fundraising. Brian Miller, who's a magician and is actually going to rely on magic to help us learn how to connect better with donors. So some really cool speakers and sessions coming up for you. And the best part is that it's entirely free. So you can go to niosummit.com, neosummit.com, and get your free ticket today. So be sure and do that. Now, I want to hand things over to Brady. Brady is a good friend. We work together every day at the NextAfter Institute, trying to equip you and others with new research and data to help you grow your fundraising. He's the managing director of the NextAfter Institute, and he has really just been steeped in this data of higher ed fundraising for the past several months. So I'm going to hand it over to Brady to walk us through the higher ed online fundraising scorecard. And Brady, if you want to unmute yourself, that would be awesome.
Rookie move. Thanks, Nathan, and thank you all for being here. So we do want to talk about this research, and we have to say off the top, thank you to iDonate, who partnered with us on this research, and it was the reason why we were able to do this research and make it available to you. So also wanted to say that. So here's where we're going today. I'm going to start by going over a little bit of the methodology or the approach that's kind of going into the study. I think it's important to know some of our biases, perhaps, that come into any sort of data collection, and especially as we get into the tips to optimize and improve the online giving experience. Where are we coming from? So there's really one macro finding, and then we're going to position the other key findings as like opportunities to improve the online giving experience. We'll touch very briefly on email. We do cover it in the study a little bit more, and I'll share a little bit more why we do that or why we aren't spending more time. Then I do want to have a little time for Ray and iDonate to share a little bit more about why they partnered with us on this research. Well, that'll come at the end, and then we'll be here for as many questions as we possibly can take until you're gone. And so, we're trying to combine a bunch of different information and research into a short presentation, a lot of time for questions. This is free research. You can download it at higheredonlinefundraising.com, and has all these types of things. It'll dive deeper into all the stats. So, in addition to getting the slide deck and the recording, there is a full research study that will cover this as well. So on the research study, here's what we did. We ended up including 109 higher ed organizations. Now, about half of those, 51%, were what we called large universities. 21% were actually community colleges, an area and an industry or a subvertical that I haven't seen a lot of research on, actually. So it was an interesting inclusion that iDonate wanted us to look at. And then 28% were small or liberal arts organizations. And they're small, not necessarily in revenue. Some of them generate a lot of revenues. It's more small in terms of student body size or student body population. So a mix of different organizations, half large, and then roughly a quarter community college, roughly a quarter small liberal arts. And then the methodology is we started from the homepage, and then we went through and made a $20 donation and tracked the whole experience, grabbed screen grabs, and we answered about 28 different questions during the online giving experience to actually analyze or have some data points to say what was good or bad or what was our experience. And then we also collected the emails that we received for 45 days after we became a donor. We sent those emails out to Mechanical Turk and had 3 independent people classify those emails as a confirmation or a thank you, a solicitation email where the main intent was to ask, or a confirmation or a cultivation email, sorry, where basically anything other than a thank you or a solicitation was cultivation. So newsletters and things like that. And then we tied that back to the data set and looked at the different trends overall and across each organization. So this type of approach is one of the things that we do at the NextAfter Institute. We call this our forensic research, or where we're trying to observe 2 things. One, what is it like to be a donor? So we actually step into the shoes of a donor and make these donations. So we try to understand what's it like on the donor side. And then the other side, what is it like to be an organization, or what is it that organizations are actually doing? In this case, how are higher ed organizations going about online fundraising? And what's neat is we've done the same methodology a few times. So today you'll see kind of other nonprofits, and that's actually comparing to 204 other nonprofits that we did the exact same giving methodology to, and 199 other nonprofits where we did the exact same email methodology. So you'll see some compare and contrast to kind of other nonprofits, so we can try to get a sense of how the online giving experience compares for higher ed compared to other industries and verticals. So that's kind of the study itself and forensic, especially when we get into kind of providing tips and ideas. You're going to see a lot of different experiments. So if you've ever attended something from NextAfter, you know that we share these experiments, and we sit on 2,500 different experiments from real nonprofits. And this is the applied research side. So these experiments are publicly available. You can click on them. You can see the hypothesis, the control, the treatment, statistical significance. And in this case, which we'll reference a little bit later on, this is a donation page test, where the only difference was right here. That pre-selected $50 donation amount is pre-selected in each case, the control and the treatment, except in the treatment, it was highlighted with this kind of most popular treatment. And just by adding that most popular treatment, the only change that they made, they saw an 8% increase in conversion, a 15% increase in average gift. More donations, more on average means a lot more revenue, a 24% increase in overall revenue from that one little change. And then we can kind of dig into these experiments more and see things like this actually had a 44% increase in conversion for people on a mobile device, where people are moving more quickly. And so these kind of pre-selections and nudges are maybe even more important. So this is part of the applied research that we try to bring into studies and trainings and things like this. And again, we're trying to observe human behavior, now action, not just what do people say, not what do you think, not what do I think, but what are donors and humans and people actually responding to? That's what we're trying to infuse in this as well. A question we get asked all the time is like, well, where do these experiments come from? And 2 main sources. One, we have a free open source testing and tracking tool. So there's a couple hundred nonprofits around the world that actually run and log experiments in here. It integrates with the different types of tools that you might use, from MailChimp to HubSpot, Google Analytics, etc. We use this internally as a way to track and record and store experiments. And then organizations have the option to publish this to our library that we can then use and teach and train from. But the vast majority of those actually come from our own work with clients. Consulting team and consulting company is fundamentally what we are. Me and Nathan and a few others, we're more on the research training side, but consulting is really what we do. We work hand in hand with a bunch of nonprofits, and we really focus on data and testing. That's really our methodology of how do we grow online fundraising. So we run a ton of these experiments, and our clients gratefully let us share those with you and other nonprofits to try to learn from what's going on. And because I'm not on the client services team, I can brag about how good they are at what they do. Here was a Slack message from Kevin, our CTO, talking about how we were able to move one of our oldest clients from $800,000 in revenue to $9.5 million over a 5-year period in terms of online revenue. Or we'll see charts like this where we see pretty significant and substantial online fundraising growth. And why that's important, not just to brag on our team, but this is what we infuse into our trainings, is saying this is what we do with our clients to achieve these types of results. How do we unpack and decode these things and make them as accessible as we can to nonprofits like you? That's our mission. Whether it's consulting or research or training, this is what we're trying to do. So we combine this forensic research, applied research, and our consulting work to try to figure out what is working and how can we help you. So that's what's going into this research and where we're coming from. All right, enough about us and where we're coming from. Let's get into the study. Here's the big macro key finding. The online giving experience to higher ed organizations has a lot of room to be improved. And if you've ever given to your alma mater, if you work at higher ed, you probably are something like, yeah, no duh. We know this, we could see this coming. But to actually quantify it, here's what we found. You can see that actually large universities, not significantly so, but large universities scored poorer than both small liberal arts and community colleges. But across the board, the average higher ed score was 40%. So we attribute this criteria, scoring criteria, where we add positive or negative points based on what we've seen in our research library work in terms of helping provide a better online giving experience or not. And so for some context, when we did the same study with 204 nonprofits, the average score was 59%. So that's a pretty significant gap between higher ed online giving experience and kind of the general other nonprofit experience. So that was pretty stark. We knew that it probably wouldn't be as good, but this is a pretty large gap. And then the other interesting thing is we thought, or I assumed, that there would be maybe some large universities that would have a really great online giving experience, and then maybe, you know, small organizations or community colleges maybe drag down the average. And that's not really what we found. We found that, you know, 8 out of 10, 82% of higher ed organizations scored less than 50%. Now compare that to 27% of other nonprofits, meaning everyone was pretty much not very good. There was a few that performed slightly above average, but for the most part, this was a collective, not very good online giving experience across higher ed, across verticals. And why it's so important for us to move into this conversation now about improving is, you know, higher eds have a lot of other things, right? You're trying to get students, you've got alumni, you've got major donors, but when we do this analysis of where do major donors come from, we find that 20 to 50% of major donors come from this kind of broad-based level, often like $100 or so. So this type of, how do you improve the online giving experience to A, get more of these folks, and B, have a really good experience, is actually really critical, not just to revenue today, but really generating that pool of prospects for mid-level and major giving down the line. So what we want to spend the rest of the time focused on was like, well, why did higher ed organizations score so poorly? And specifically, how can it be improved? So here's the 4 opportunities that I'm going to highlight, and then we're going to dive in a little deeper, and hopefully you get a bunch of little ideas along the way. So we're going to talk about removing unhelpful friction, providing a better reason to give, focusing more on recurring giving, and using the thank you page more strategically. All right, so opportunity number 1 here is removing unnecessary and unhelpful friction. So friction defined here in the world of what we're talking about, this comes from the folks at Unbounce. It's the psychological resistance that your visitors experience when trying to complete an action. They go on to say friction is a conversion killer. Now, in the framework that we often teach from, which comes from the good folks at Mech Labs, that we use this conversion heuristic, or this framework, to think about how do people make a decision. And you can see here that friction features prominently in this conversion heuristic. And this is on the negative side. You can see that it's a minus sign right before the friction. And it's combined with anxiety to actually create cost factors. So things like, is my donation trustworthy? Is this organization worthwhile? These are anxiety factors. And then there's also friction factors within the giving experience that we'll talk about. And these stop, slow, or kill conversions and online donations. And then we got to combat those with things like incentives, a value proposition, understanding the donor's motivation. And as long as we do a better job of increasing value and decreasing costs, in theory, more people will lead to a conversion, or in our case, a donation. So friction features very prominently, and it can kill the online giving experience. And so when we do our research and we teach and train, we kind of categorize the different types of friction into these 7 buckets. And when we actually do these types of research experiments, we collect data on 5 of these different types of friction. And for higher ed, we found that they scored higher or significantly higher than all other nonprofits in 4 of these 5 areas, meaning that there is not just a lot of friction in one area, but across multiple areas, higher ed are introducing a lot of friction into the online giving experience. So we're going to walk through some of these and show some examples, starting with field number friction. So field number friction is just really the more fields you have, particularly required fields, the more likely someone is to abandon the giving process. So we actually looked at what non-essential information, so information that you don't need to complete a gift, what was required. And we found that higher ed organizations were almost twice as likely to require non-essential information, require it to complete your gift. 77% of higher eds compared to more like 40% of other nonprofits here. But what type of information? Well, you can see here the one standout was the phone. Almost 6 out of 10 higher ed organizations required you to provide a phone number in order to make a donation. This is quite a bit higher than other nonprofits where it's around a quarter. So the higher ed organizations were a lot more likely to require non-essential information, and the bulk of that comes from the phone. Now, why this is important is We've seen experiments where adding a required cell phone field, in this case, for example, actually dropped revenue 50%. Dropped revenue 50% by requiring a cell phone field. This is that example of field number friction. So the tip or the idea is, how do you improve the online giving experience? Is think about what's not necessary. How do we make those fields not required? We have seen making the phone field optional, for example, have no difference on the conversion rate. Yes, you'll get fewer. You probably get 20 to maybe 50% of people will give you the phone number. But A, those are the people that want you to have the phone number anyway, so you're not wasting your time. And B, you're not losing potential donors because you're requiring that information. There's also this idea of the more personal or sensitive or valuable that information that you're asking for me is, the less likely I'm willing to give it to you, right? If you want to know my first name, last name, maybe my middle name, sure, you can have my middle name. I don't really care. But you're not going to ask for my social security number. Forget it. I'm out of here, right? And the cell phone isn't quite social security level, but it's pretty high up there in terms of a piece of guarded information. So when you ask for that, and not just ask for, but require it, it can be a big stop for a lot of folks. So the question is, well, what if you need that information, right? What if you do thankathons and you've got a phone program and things like that? Well, there is value in using the phone. There's no question. The folks at Bloomerang did a study earlier that was published earlier this year, where they looked at over 3,700 organizations in the US and Canada and almost 2 million donor records. And they found that if someone just received a thank you call within 90 days, donor retention went up 8%. The second gift, average gift, went up 100%. It was twice as large if they just received a phone call. And they were 203 days quicker to make that second gift. So the thing that you have to balance, particularly for something like the phone, but anytime you require a piece of information, is there a downstream value here? Do we have a plan to optimize or get that downstream value? And is it worth the trade-off of the short-term loss? And so that's something that only you can answer for your organization. And generally speaking, especially with a cell phone field, our default is, I'm not sure that actually is worth it. You can always get that information afterwards and in other ways. But the bigger point here is, especially when it comes to form field friction, is remove unnecessary required form fields that don't definitively help or enhance the donor experience later or improve your downstream revenue. That's kind of the rule of thumb. So when we look at the few examples, you can see here on the left how this was a required phone fields. Just one example of many that we saw where they required the phone. And then here's a different example. Now these fields weren't required, but if you look at it, it's spouse name, spouse name, spouse name. And so even though this isn't required, it still looks like it's more information that you're asking of me. And so it can actually increase the perceived cost that someone has, and it might actually lead to someone abandon the giving process. So the idea here is remove unnecessary required fields and use those other optional fields very sparingly. You know, it might seem like, oh, well, let's ask them this and ask them this, just make it optional. That still increases this idea of perceived cost that someone might be seeing when they just look at your form. And that also ties into this other form of friction called field layout friction. So this is really how form fields are laid out can actually increase or decrease this perception of cost or time needed to complete something, which means they may abandon or they may not even start. So for example, here's an experiment, the exact same information on the form from the left to the right, exact same information, exact same donation page, but you can see they had a 39% increase in donations because they used horizontal space to group fields together and it shortened the form. So it's the same amount of information, but it feels a lot less cost for me as the person. I'm more likely to start, more likely to complete, 40% increase in donations just by laying out the form field different. This is an example of field layout friction. So it's not just about what information is required or collected, it's also how you lay it out. So if we go back to these two examples with the required and the not required, on this side, look at all this dead space that makes this form feel very narrow and very crammed. So even it's not actually asking for a lot of information, it's still creating more like visual friction in my mind of saying like, ooh, I don't know if I actually want to fill that out, instead of using more of that horizontal space. Or in this case, they use some of that horizontal space, but again, because they're asking for this very unnecessary, unbeneficial to me information that's also kind of private. Why do you want to know my spouse? Or maybe I don't have a spouse, or maybe my spouse is deceased. You know, you're bringing up a potential subject here that's somewhat sensitive. And now it creates the page that feels longer. And it also makes this top form feel cramped because you're asking for that information even if it's not required. This is partly why radio buttons are very poor when it comes to the online giving experience, particularly for mobile, because it extends the length of the page, which makes it feel longer. Look at all this dead white space over on the side that is not adding any value here. So part of the idea here is, how do you group form fields together and use that horizontal space so the form actually feels or looks like it's less daunting, it's actually less work. So field number and field layout friction often work together. And we saw that, especially with requiring phone, that was a big thing that higher eds had. So the other thing that we looked at is confusion friction. So confusion friction is when there's like unexpected items to navigate, competing calls to action, or maybe distracting links and messages. These are things that actually cause donors confusion when they're going through the online giving experience. One of the biggest case studies that we have in our research library is this, where this organization had top line navigation and a donate button, even though this is on their donate page. And they said, what if we just remove that? Do we really want people clicking donate and going through the donate loop or visiting events or blog? No, so just get rid of it. This is a pretty extreme example, but for them, it increased donations 195%. It was a bit of a smaller sample, still valid, but we don't expect to see a 200% increase just by removing navigation. But the idea is this confusion friction. If you try to step in the minds of a donor, you click donate, and now look at all these little distractions, or maybe look at that donate button and you think, oh, maybe I didn't click the right button. And then they click donate again, they end up on the same page. So if we look at this large university here as an example, once we click donate, here's the page that we visited. Look at some of the confusion friction points that go on right away here. One, areas to support, get involved, news and events. Those things sound interesting. Maybe you want to do those. And do you have a login? I don't know. Give to the university. I would like to give. Maybe I'm already in that page. Search for what? And then on the bottom, you've got other navigation. And look at all these social media things. Maybe you can go Snapchat right now, right? The likelihood that they'll go and do Snapchat right now is maybe not high, but these are still confusion points that can take donors who are trying to donate, they've expressed intent, away from a donation page. We found that 64% of higher ed organizations had these types of distracting links on their donation page, which is a high amount. We found that it was 55% for other nonprofits. So that's still way too high. So one of the easy things is just remove all these distracting links. You don't want to be taking people to other parts of your site once they have visited and expressed the interest to make a donation. We saw a lot of it with higher eds. So there's the distracting links, but then there's also this other type of confusion where if we look at this experiment, so one, like, what an eyesore. Look at all the confusion friction going on in terms of the navigation. So they should get rid of all of that stuff. But look at this. You see learn more and add to basket. Pretty much equally weighted in terms of size. One's actually prioritized. And this is a Catholic organization where you can donate and get things like beads and things like that. Do they really want you to learn more? Or do they want you to add to the basket? Do you know what you want to do? What happens when you add learn more? It's confusing. So they said, let's just get rid of it in the treatment. They saw a 32% increase in donor conversion. People can go find the information that they need to do. You don't need to introduce a secondary call to action or a conflicting call to action. This also adds confusion friction. So if we go back to this example again, look at what they're doing right here, right? So it may seem somewhat innocuous, but they're saying like, please visit. They're asking you to visit this link on the donation page. And what makes it worse is look at the eye path, right? The eye path we go down is generally linear, and then we scan to the right and kind of that F path for some supporting content. So in this case, they have non-useful and distracting information right in the eye path. And the thing that you want to do, donate, is actually not in the direct eye path. So if you just visit, your eye path goes right to this, please visit this URL. And I bet you if they ran this test or could do kind of hot jar testing, they'd be shocked at how many people actually go click this link because of the way it's designed and this possibly accidental call to action for people to visit this PDF, right? We found that 43% of higher ed organizations had multiple calls to action not related to giving on their donation page. Again, that's pretty high. Other nonprofits, it was 38%. This is a simple thing to do to improve the online giving experiences. Remove these distracting links and additional calls to action. Just get rid of them. There's even little things that we can do to just help people know what you have to do to complete the donation. In this test, all they did was go step 1, choose your amount, step 2, provide this information, step 3, 30% increase in donations. You'd be shocked at how confusing the online giving process actually is for the average everyday, oftentimes older donor. So these types of things, distracting links, multiple calls to action, even just not stepping up the form and making it clear, it all adds up to this idea of confusion friction. So instead, we can remove those things, but we should also add clarity and even just like complete donation below. Again, if you've worked in this area, especially in gift processing, customer service, you know how difficult it can be for many donors. So we can add some clarity and reduce the confusion friction. And then decision friction. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because there's so much going on in decisions and how donors make decisions and how we can tap into that when it comes to the online giving experience. But decision friction, there's a bunch of different things. One is maybe like too many decisions overall, which like increases cognitive load. And if we're asked to make too many decisions, we'll shut down. It could be too many options at once, where there's like leads to indecision or paralysis. And this is also closely related to confusion friction. When we introduce different decisions, especially that aren't seemingly related to our donation, it's also confusion. So confusion and decision friction kind of go side by side. And an example of this in an experiment from our library looks at this. This is a child sponsorship organization. And if you put your birthday into the homepage, they would actually show you different children that either had or had your birthday or closely had your birthday. And then you could choose one of those children. It's a great idea. How do you create a more relevant connection to a possible child and kind of narrow down the options? But they said, well, it's still 3 children, and then there's rows of other kids below it. What if we could kind of prioritize one kid? Would that make it easier for someone to actually make the decision to sponsor a child? They added in a little design to have some context and continuity there. They actually saw a 14% increase in donations by prioritizing the one child instead of making a donor choose from rows and rows and rows of children. And they've actually replicated that in other areas. This is a geographic focus page. So when you choose Indonesia, rows and rows and rows of kids versus here's one child that you can choose from. And they saw a 48% increase in conversions. This is helping reduce the decision friction, or at least make it easier to saying, you don't know which child to sponsor? What about this one? And it makes it so much easier for us to say, yes, sounds great, and move on. So what's really unique to higher ed is when we look at the non-essential information to complete, we saw a required fund designation up around 15%, that no other nonprofits ever come close to being that high. And also this like connection relationship, you know, alumni or alumni year, how'd you hear about us? This is also significantly higher for higher ed, even though it's less than 10%. It doesn't even show up when we do other studies. And particularly the fund designation, we kind of had some fun in the office because some of the decision-making around fund designations is pretty crazy. So here's just like one example where you had to choose a fund. So required must choose a fund, and required must also choose a sub-fund from a drop-down. And if you want to look at what that looks like, maybe more visually, this is kind of what it looks like. So select from this long list, no context, oddly named things. So if you choose athletics, then, oh, which team would you also like to support? So I actually did this example choosing baseball. I played baseball in college and played against that very school. And I actually made 3 errors in 1 inning on their campus. So this is my version of revenge. It's like, look at your friction. Every time I drive by their campus in Chicago, I still like get the jitters about how badly I played. Anyways, there's so many decisions that we're asking donors to make and requiring them, fund and sub-fund. There's this thing called the paradox of choice, where if there's too many options available, people either regret the decision thinking I made a bad one, or they'll just make no decision. So there's this famous study involving jellies or jams, where they had 2 different tables in supermarkets, and in one they had 24 exotic jellies, because who doesn't want mincemeat jelly? And versus a setup that had 6 jellies, so still kind of exotic jellies, but only 6. And they found that more people stopped by to look at the table with 24 exotic jellies, but way more people actually purchased from the table that only had 6 exotic jellies. And this is part of the challenge, is when you sit, I'm sure in your team meetings, or you hear from donors, well, I want to give to this fund and I want to give to this fund. Here's all the options that you could want. But then if you put yourselves in the donor's shoes you're trying to give, it's overwhelming. Maybe they're making the wrong decision. Do they know how to actually find the thing? So there's an advantage of maybe doing more streamlined fund designation like this. This organization pre-selected the kind of where needed most, so that if you didn't want to go through the process of choosing a fund, it was pre-selected for you. And for the large universities, the University of Wisconsin here, they streamlined it down to 4 options. 1 was pre-selected, the kind of chancellor's fund, which is their kind of version of the general fund. Then they had 2 other most common funds, so like scholarship, and I actually can't read what the other one actually says, but they kind of said, here's the one that we're going to default you to. Here's kind of 2 other popular ones, and then you can always click other designation. This is a way to streamline the decision-making and also figure out, where do most people end up giving? Why are you making everyone go through this friction-filled decision-making process when most people end up giving to these areas anyways, right? So pre-selection, you can always choose. The idea is, how do you limit the number of decisions a donor has to make and from the number of available options within that choice? If you remember that very, very first experiment I showed you about the kind of most popular pre-selection, this is actually a way to limit decision friction. They're using something called status quo bias, where we're most likely to just continue on with something that's actually pre-selected for us, right? So they've pre-selected the $50 donation amount. 36% of higher eds used a pre-selection, just FYI. But then they also use social proof, this idea where we're more likely to copy someone else's actions if we know about it, even if we don't know who that person is or if it's truthful. We're weirdly wired, connected social beings. So by pre-selecting it and adding in some social proof, it makes it so much easier for someone to just go through and make a $50 donation. And again, particularly for people on mobile devices who are going extra quick. So the idea is, how do you limit the number of decisions a donor can make, especially amongst when there's like many available options? And can you use things like defaults or suggestions or social nudges to actually help limit decision friction? It's one of the biggest areas of friction and one of the most unique things to higher ed that we saw. So there's got to be a better way than just choosing from hundreds of funds and sub-funds and requiring people to do so. And then the last type of friction that we want to look at is steps friction. So this is really like the more clicks, but it's really about separate steps to a donation process, or actual like full page loads is what we try to count, of how many extra steps is there in the giving process. And as you have more and more extra steps, again, the likelihood of someone abandoning the donation also goes up, especially when you have your donation tool on a third-party domain, right? If it opens a new tab and they go out, I've seen research that says that'll decrease giving about 20%. So if you're having multiple steps and you're linking out, now you're kind of compounding friction. And this is also true for people on mobile devices. You know, 2 steps feels like a lot more. And so an example of this is what we call an "Are you sure you want to give" page that we run into sometimes. So you can see on the left, it looks very much like a receipt or a confirmation page, except it has the gray on gray bar there that says process donation, because you're not actually done yet. This just says, here's what you're about to do. Do you want to do it? And the organization was like, do we really have to have this page? So they removed it, and they found 176% increase in donations by removing this unnecessary step. This is an example, again, of steps friction. So we look at higher ed, we look at how many organizations had 3 or more. Our research has, it's unclear whether 1 or 2 is better, but we have seen once you get above 3 or more, then it does start to have a very significant role. And 77% of higher ed organizations had 3 or more steps to complete a donation. That's compared to just 30% of other nonprofits. So higher eds were a lot more likely to have a multi-step, full page loads donation solution. So one example, a small liberal arts organization, you go from homepage, you click give. Here's step 1, you got to make some of those decisions, designations. Step 2, you have to put in information. Step 3, are you really sure you want to do this? And then you see the thank you page. That's a fairly common kind of 3-step process. We look at which types of organizations were more likely to have multiple steps. It was large universities. Almost 90% had 3 or more in their giving experience, compared to just 53% in small liberal arts, and then 82% community colleges. Now, community colleges were a little bit more likely to link out to kind of a third-party donation tool, which added a step. But large universities often had this extra step that would look something like this. You know, you'd click give from the homepage, and then you'd go to a giving site, or maybe the foundation itself. And then you'd have all these other myriad of options, and then you'd have to click give again. So it's interesting here is you click give now, but it's not really a give now, because you still have to click another button, and then you get into the giving flow. And then you can see they still have the 3 additional steps and an "Are you sure you want to give" page, plus the required fund and the required sub-fund. So you can see that large universities have this whole other extra step, which is a challenge, right? You have a massive homepage, it gets a lot of traffic and a lot of different users with a lot of different motivation. So how do you get around this extra step? Is it going directly into the giving flow? Is it kind of preparing people to say, are you interested in giving? You know, it's one of the things in the report, we kind of did a little side-by-side of giving to the university foundation versus the university and the similarities and differences. It is a unique challenge to higher ed, but the idea here is reduce and remove the unnecessary steps. That's one of the easiest ways to, again, limit donation page friction and increase conversion. So again, when we look at these different types of friction, and 4 of the 5 that we capture in the study, higher eds was significantly higher than other nonprofits. And then particularly the confusion, decision, and steps friction. This is very, very problematic in terms of getting people through the giving experience. partly because it adds the extra friction, and then partly when we look at mobile device. So the mobile giving experience for higher eds was actually better than other nonprofits in terms of it being mobile optimized or not needing to pinch and zoom, which is great. So it's, again, higher than other nonprofits. But when we look at friction on a mobile device, it doesn't just add up, it actually compounds. Think about going through multiple steps on your phone and requiring a fund and a sub-fund and all those other types of friction. It's a lot worse on mobile, and especially if it works with other types of friction. Again, it doesn't add up, it compounds. So the friction was one of the biggest things that just kind of like smacked you in the face when you did the analysis or when you actually went through and made the donations. It's a big opportunity to remove unnecessary, unhelpful friction. So you spent a lot of time on that one because it's the most important, or kind of the biggest insight. We're gonna spend a little bit more time on this one as well because it's hugely important, and then the other two are gonna go pretty quick. So opportunity 2, provide a better, stronger, more clear reason to give. So we found that only 22%, so less than a quarter, of higher ed organizations had a strong reason to give on their donation pages compared to 33% of other nonprofits. So again, if we look back to this conversion heuristic, we already talked about the cost and the friction side. But on the positive side, one of the biggest things that you and I and we have as fundraisers and marketers is our message, is our value proposition, particularly making it clear why someone should give to you as opposed to another organization or not at all. This is the actual question we ask as researchers when we make these donations, is try to figure out how is the organization answering this question, and are they doing it well? And the lens that we look through is, are they using any one or some combination of these 4 ways? Do they have something that I want? This is what we call appeal or likability. Is this something I can get anywhere else? This is exclusivity. Do I actually understand what my donation will do? This is clarity. And then do I actually believe them, and why? This is credibility. So when we score these value propositions or look at did they do a good job, we try to look at appeal, exclusivity, clarity, and credibility. So when we look at why did higher eds kind of score so poorly, again, I keep picking on this university here. There's just one example of many. It's just easy to go back to one teaching example. So sorry, University of Houston. But if you look at this page, and just reflect on it briefly. You can chat yourself maybe, but why should I give to this organization as opposed to another one, or not at all? Now, hopefully I have some connection to University of Houston. I've had some connection to this organization, but here's what they tell me. For online giving support and questions regarding alternate giving methods, please call this. Defaults me to Here We Go and the Here We Go campaign. But coming from the homepage, I don't have any context for that campaign. I don't have any context for what my donation will do. This very much assumes you know everything you need to know about making this donation, and there's nothing else we can do to influence your generosity, right? It's very hard to answer that question because they didn't use any copy or text. 54% of higher ed organizations used less than a sentence, so basically nothing, to try to communicate. They're assuming I know everything and I have everything at my disposal, and that's just not true. We've seen this in our library. Control, 1 sentence versus treatment, 5 short paragraphs, 150% increase in donations by taking time to try to explain why someone should give to you as opposed to another organization, or not at all. So do you need to have 4 or 5 paragraphs? Our research would say yes, but you have to have some copy. You have to have some reason on your donation page. And it's not just about having any copy. It can be what type of copy or how to use it strategically. So this organization's that one that had the small liberal arts organization that had the multi-step. We actually look at their donation page. You can see their kind of value proposition, or why I should give, or why I should be more generous, or how do I know how my donation will be used, is over here to the right. And so first thing is that it's, again, not in the iPath. This is where supporting content goes, trust marks and things like that, which, by the way, only 3% of higher ed organizations used trust marks, Charity Navigator, things like that on their donation page. So very few people used trust marks at all. But this is where supporting content should go. But this is the meat. This is what I should know about my donation, and it's out of the iPath. But then if you actually look at what they actually say, how would you score this? Is this appealing? Is this exclusive? Is this clear? Is this credible? Right? There's a little bit about, Wheaton students, but it's pretty vague. They talk about completion time and how the donation page is secure, so maybe a little trust or credibility. But unless you've fully made up your mind, and even then, it's not inspiring generosity compared to this. This organization took quite a bit of time to actually use copy. They were one of only 20% of organizations that had 4 sentences or more. And if we actually kind of zoom in on this, I'll give you a little chance to read through, but how would you score this one? Is this appealing? Is this exclusive? Is this clear? Is this credible? We'll use some fancy color coding here to actually walk through some of this. But if we look at, is this appealing? right away, tax deductible gift, strategic investment, future of America. Again, for your ideal donor, not just any random, but for their ideal donor. Strategic investment, future of America. That sounds, pretty appealing, I would imagine. Is this exclusive? We don't take a penny of federal support. There's many institutions that don't, but it's one of the things that makes them unique, and they call it out right away. Is it clear? Your gift ensures that. And then they bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point in terms of what donations actually go towards. And then credible. Look, it reached hundreds of thousands, 4.8 million. We're on Capitol Hill. It's tax deductible. There's things that add in trust and credibility within their messaging. So not only do you have to have some copy on your page, you have to try to articulate why a donation is needed and what it will actually do, focusing on things like appeal, exclusivity, clarity, and credibility. And so when we look at, who had the stronger value proposition, kind of surprisingly, at least to me, community colleges, 4.5 times and 2.5 times more likely to have a strong value proposition than large universities and small universities or liberal arts organizations. And I think two things are at play. One, we found that they were a lot more likely to use copy and actually explain why a donation was needed. And the other thing is they probably don't have as much like brand arrogance, right? Of like, us, we're big, we're awesome, you should give to us. They probably have to fight a little bit harder and communicate why a donation is needed, or at least they feel like they have to do. And then it comes through. As a donor, you have a much better idea of what your donation is actually, why it's needed and what it actually does, right? So you might be saying, oh, they already know us. We just got to get them through the giving process. We don't need to say any more copy. No, that's not it at all, right? I already showed you this one example by just saying step 1, step 2, step 3, seemingly not useful, 30% increase in donations. But we've seen things like this where 2 short sentences at the bottom of a donate button at the very end of the giving process, 30% increase in donation. It's not just having the message kind of once or before they get to your page, but we can influence it throughout the giving experience. This organization, unfortunately, had to use a checkout cart example, but they said, well, how do we kind of improve the e-commerce checkout? They put this little sticky message that keeps some of the value proposition available and insight throughout the giving process as they go through those number of steps. 14% increase in donations. So it's about having a reason to give in the first place, not just once, but actually kind of throughout the giving experience. But higher ed organizations, just like other nonprofits, have to do a better job at providing this strong, clear reason to give, not just once, but kind of throughout the giving experience. All right, opportunity 3, focus more on recurring giving. I think most people know by now that kind of, one-time donors, their chart over time looks something like this, but sustainers or monthly donors, their chart looks something like this, right? Where monthly donors were 2 times more in a year, at least 5 times more over their lifetime, more like 10 to 11 times more for small and medium-sized organizations. And we continue to see online first-time recurring donor growth kind of skyrocketing. And a lot of it's because of a lot of the kind of for-profit e-commerce purchasing behaviors blowing in our favor. So McKinsey & Company a few years ago found that subscription e-commerce was doubling every year for the past 5 years, and particularly for 25 to 44-year-olds. So a very kind of prime demographic for a lot of higher ed organizations who are looking at young professionals and young alumni. Recurring giving and subscription purchasing is very much in their wheelhouse. So what we found when we looked at recurring giving is 10% of organizations did not allow you to set up a recurring gift at all. We actually saw the same thing for other nonprofits. So 1 out of every 10, you just can't, even if you wanted to. Only 10% provided any sort of like reason or value proposition about why I should make a monthly gift, meaning the vast majority who allowed recurring just had a checkbox. This was one example where they actually took some time talking about, hey, this is how monthly giving works or how it goes further. We've seen cases where by adding in just like, 2 lines here on the did you know on the value of recurring giving, that saw a 48% increase in new recurring donors, no significant impact to one-time donors. So if you're trying to focus on recurring giving, similar to that value proposition, you have to give them a reason. Why should they sign up for monthly? Do they even know it's available? If you're relying solely on a checkbox, you're just not going to get a lot of recurring donors. Found that only 3% of higher ed organizations defaulted to a monthly gift, meaning like it was pre-selected for you. Again, trying to use status quo bias. This is quite a bit less than other nonprofits, which is closer to like 10, 20%. And this is something that like environment organizations, public media do a lot. So I chatted with someone who did a lot of testing at Sierra Club, and they passed on some of this information where this default strategy into monthly was something they used to help grow their recurring revenue from $200,000 to $1 million. Now, I say a word of caution here because this isn't always true for all people at all times. For them, they found that kind of all channels, campaigns, and prospects, it was great. But if people were coming from paid search, where they were actually looking for something, or organic search, where again, they're looking for something, this actually had a no increase or even a small negative effect. And what we found is often for repeat visitors or repeat donors, when we try to push recurring on them, sometimes they reject it, whereas new ones are receptive. But if people have more motivation and they know what they want to do, sometimes it can be over the edge or it can be too aggressive. So try defaulting to a monthly gift, but especially when you're driving the message, when you're running the ads, when you're kind of incepting the motivation on why they should give, and maybe not for people that are long-term loyal donors in terms of defaulting, unless you're asking them, saying, please make a recurring gift, then for sure, point to a landing page that's defaulted to recurring. And if you're thinking about, well, how do we get maybe more recurring gifts, or if we're doing a default strategy, another possibly counterintuitive thing that we've seen in our research is actually starting with a smaller amount, like in this case, starting with 10 instead of 15, can actually increase the number of recurring donors. In this case, it was 125%. And what's interesting is no difference in average gift. We saw this again where this organization uses a pop-up. So you click give and it actually pops up and says, hey, maybe you should make a monthly gift. Defaults them to 15. They said, maybe we could kind of default people to 19 and kind of grow the revenue. They actually saw a 43% decrease in revenue per visitor. So there's this idea of cognitive momentum, or how we make small decisions. And when we see a number that feels too big, we say no right away. Whereas if we see a small number, we kind of say yes. And then we see the pre-selection or the nudge and we go, yeah, I could maybe do 15. So one idea here is to maybe try starting with a smaller donation amount first. But the idea is we didn't see a lot of focus on recurring, and I think it's a big area of opportunity for higher eds. Opportunity number 4 is use the thank you page and confirmation page more strategically. So we found that half of higher ed organizations did not even thank us in a clear, tangible way. So this is one of the good examples of saying, thank you, here's how your donation will be put to work. So make sure you have a good, clear, tangible thank you. It sounds simple, but again, we saw a lot of times where organizations not only didn't thank us, but then there was nothing for us to do, right? So almost half of higher ed organizations had a thank you page that looks something like this, where it's like, all done, see you later. Whereas I've just gone through this process with a lot of friction and told you that I care. I'm on your website. What else can I do? We've seen organizations have the ability to do a recurring upgrade immediately on the thank you page at about a 5% rate, or ask for another one-time gift to a different fund or a different project, 29%. So again, huge conversion rate, but less revenue because it's one-time versus recurring. So, you got to figure out the numbers, which makes sense for yourself. But the idea is, someone's already on your page. Is there something you can do? We've seen examples like Leukemia and Lymphoma or Billy Graham. They both use this idea of doing a one-click upgrade with value proposition on why you should do it. So whether it's a give to another fund, whether it's upgrade to recurring, there should be something for them to do on that page. We found that about half had nothing for us to do. So have at least one clear call to action, and only 1 in 10 had this kind of give to another area. And again, with so many different parts to a higher ed organization, this could be a real opportunity, right? You give to the scholarship fund, maybe you'd like to give to athletics, or you give to athletics, maybe you'd like to give to Chancellor's Fund. You'd be surprised how many people would actually make another gift. So can you consider adding a recurring gift upsell, or maybe additional one-time gift call to action? And then another possible opportunity is to help solve the designation problem afterwards. So maybe while you go through the giving process, say, you'll be able to choose how you want to best support the university afterwards, or something like that. And then on the thank you page, this is the only example I could find where someone used that. And they said, here, how do you want to designate your gift? Now that we've gone through, we haven't introduced unnecessary friction, they've completed their donation. Now they can maybe reflect and say, how would you like this to be used in a way that won't compromise their ability to get through the donation page? So could you try using a post-donation designation? So reduce some of that decision friction, put it on the end when they're maybe more open and reflective. So whether you try an additional gift, a clear call to action, a designation, we didn't see a lot of higher ed organizations use that thank you page or confirmation page overly strategically. So those are some of the key findings or the opportunities. I know, kind of going quick, I'm trying to get you a lot in here. Remove unnecessary and helpful friction, provide a better reason to give, focus more on recurring, and use that thank you page more strategically. One of the questions we get a lot is, well, like, who's doing it well? So here's some of the higher scoring organizations in the study, from large universities to small liberal arts organizations and to community colleges. Again, you'll get this deck, so you don't have to, write those down. But if you're interested in saying, like, who did we think, based on our research, provided a better online giving experience, here's a number of examples so you can kind of self-select, identify. I'd encourage you to actually just go make donations to them and go through the process yourself and see what kind of interesting things you found. Because there's all kinds of interesting things, way too many for me to cover today and even in the report. So we put together this big infographic that has kind of like all the stats, and we're trying to make it easier for you to visualize and see what we saw. Things like this. It's really hard to read here, but one of the interesting things is higher ed use give language on their homepage to give, 57% compared to 13% of nonprofits. Nonprofits are way, way, way more likely, 3/4 use donate language. So that's kind of just an interesting thing, that a lot of language in higher ed is give, and most other organizations talk about donate. Or things like this right here, we already talked about how few higher ed organizations use trust marks, Charity Navigator, but even like associations or the SEC or the Pac-12, any kind of like trust mark, quote, testimonial, we didn't see like any of it at all. And even things like we didn't get a ton into gift arrays, but you can see some of the things here, like how many people had them. So higher eds were a lot more likely to not have a gift array at all, just an open field, something that we have seen actually work even within the higher ed space. So that's interesting. And then kind of pre-selection, most common amounts, things like that. So that's an infographic and extra stats you can get in the report. So then what about email? It is what we looked at. And here's why it goes really quick is higher ed organizations send very few emails in the first 45 days after a donation. When we chart the email volume, we saw that the average was 2.4 emails, and other nonprofits were 6.3. So it was 2.5 times less. And 76% of the higher ed organizations sent us less than 3 emails. That's compared to 50% of other nonprofits. And the median was 1. The median was we got 1 email in 45 days. So the kind of key takeaway was like higher ed just need to send more email. And obviously it's more nuanced than that, but the email volume was extremely low that we couldn't even do a real in-depth analysis because so many organizations just sent us 1 email, and it was most likely just a thank you or the confirmation. Now I might be saying like, well, what about COVID-19? This is crazy times. And indeed it is crazy times. We actually started tracking and benchmarking the email volume that we received from past year studies. And what we found is in this time period where we did the study, every single vertical, including education, increased email volume. And year over year email volume, according to our data and from what I've seen from everyone else, it's actually higher. So if anything, we should have received more emails from higher ed organizations in this time frame. So if you're wondering if COVID impacted, it did. It should have actually led to more emails, which means the amount that we received in a normal year would be even less. So again, outside of campaigns and giving days, it appears at least that higher eds just really are not sending very much email at all. So we did do an analysis still. So caution, small sample. We didn't get a ton of emails. And then we did a deep dive on fundraising emails itself, who it's from, what they asked for, and kind of compared and contrasted all emails to solicitation emails. So it's kind of interesting. Again, caution, small sample size, but we kind of dove deep in there. And again, that's for free in the report. So that's why we didn't spend a lot of time today talking about email, because we don't have a ton of insights because the email volume was so low. All right, so if you want to go deeper, again, you can download the free study and get all those different types of stats and see different examples, things like that, higheredonlinefundraising.com. In that report, there is a code if you want to take one of our training courses. So if you're interested in how do I optimize my donation page or my email, this code HigherEd will get you 50% off any course you like. Or if you are interested in becoming a member, we have a membership program where you can take any or all of these courses whenever you want. That code will also get you 50% off your membership. And if you're interested in membership, if you actually buy a premium ticket to NEO, you get 3-month membership for free. So check out NEO and maybe and sign up for that premium package if you're interested in the courses. So we are going to take questions in a little bit. So if you haven't put in your questions, please start firing them in. This is my son, Hendrix, on his first day of school. And one of the words he's learned now is soon. So be like, let's car, and be like, it goes soon. So we're going to do questions soon. But first, I do want to give a chance for Ray, Gary, and I Donate to just say a couple words about why they partnered with us on this research. Again, this would not be possible without I Donate and Ray's team and Ray's involvement. So Ray, do you want to share just a little bit more about I Donate and kind of why you partnered with us on this research, and then we'll move into questions. Ray, you still there? Maybe.
You might be muted.
There you go. There you go.
There we go.
I'm sorry, I was muted. No, thank you very much. And I'll just take one quick minute here so we can get back on track. But we're super pleased to be a part of this project. We're a big fan of NextAfter and the methodology and the way they approach these things. At I Donate, we're super passionate about providing exceptional giving experiences to higher ed nonprofits. Like the folks at NextAfter, our focus is around building, great solutions around today's donor and the expectations they have when they go online. We believe the future for both nonprofit and for-profit organizations will be about competing on the customer experience, or in your case, the support of the alumni as we go forward, and really understanding that life cycle for that supporter will be critical for creating these great experiences. We're talking a lot today about kind of one part of that life cycle, which is the points of giving. But of course, there's the discovery and the consideration and the advocacy is all part of that life cycle. So we believe that's really important. Second of all, just kind of wanted to cover real quick why higher ed. And as you would expect, as soon as I get on, I have a FedEx delivery man. So we're in a real life post-COVID Zoom world here. Two things on higher ed. One is understanding that expectation of today's donor is extremely important. So as you guys said earlier, it's not just about the major gifts, but it's about sort of building the champions for smaller and mid-sized gifts are all critical and important for the long-term support. So having solutions that do this well is critical, but also having solutions that have engineered many of the things that we talked about today right into our solution is really not optional anymore. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples that I think are super pertinent to what Brady talked about. One is the obvious one. We use embeddable code, not forms. So we're not making people bounce off and creating that sort of anxiety that leads to abandonment. The second thing that we've done is really interesting recently. You mentioned a lot about designated funds, and we have a lot of higher ed customers, and we go back and forth on this because there's so many designated funds they want to cover. Sometimes they have to have them, and there's no choice around that. So one of the things we've recently done is we've architected something that we've got a patent pending on, where we've contextualized that experience when that designated fund is hit. It brings up a quick image and some contextual language around that so that the donor or the supporter, in this case alumni, will know very quickly that's exactly the one I meant to give to. Because what we've found, particularly whether it's supporting people or programs, sometimes they get confused and go, is that the program I meant to give to? So that has been extremely well received with some of our customers. Third, we actually took the guys' advice and we built a designated fund option at the thank you page or at the end. Some people have tried that, some haven't, but I think the point is one of the things we've tried to do is engineer a lot of these things into our solution, including the analytics about conversion rates and tracking, average gift size and things like that, so that our solutions are not just processing the donation, but actually speaking to what the expectation of today's donor has. The second thing really quick is, fundamental, we believe just at the fundamental level that an educated society is a better society. And we know that these organizations are always under pressure for funding. So whether it's the pressure of a state budget that goes and comes based upon the economy or what's going on in a state, pressure from online offerings and new ways to teach that are always out there, or just recently, one of the big things that's hitting now is just pressure from the decreases in athletic attendance. Young people are finding new ways to watch and engage in sports, and that's in some universities has a big impact in overall revenue and things in universities. So there's always pressure to fund education. What we didn't know when we teamed up with you guys, we're going to be in the middle of a global pandemic. And so on top of all of those things, we also have a global pandemic. So, we were just pleased to support this and these findings, and we hope that these can improve the way you fundraise and better engage with your donors.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ray. And I didn't even know you had some of those features. So that was good to know. And again, thank you and I Donate for partnering with us on this project. So we're going to handle questions now. Nathan, hopefully we got some. We'll stick around as long as we can.
Absolutely. We do have a few. And Ray, you've already answered a few of them, which is great. So the question we're leading with was from Nicole, and she's asking, we're struggling with the current vendor that we use for just donation pages. So any recommended vendors? And I think that question has clearly been answered. So go check out I Donate for sure.
Yeah, we'll even send you a free t-shirt, but yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah. We're in it for the perks over here.
Yeah, we have swag too.
I love it. I love it. A question from Ricky, and Brady, I'm curious what your thoughts are here. So what Ricky said, and I'm not a data scientist, or I don't have a research PhD or by any stretch. We're marketers. But Ricky's asking, what is the type of framework that this research is based off of? He throws out a framework called MIC. I'm not familiar with that. Brady, I'm not sure if you are or not either. But maybe more broadly, if you could recap, what's sort of the lens that we took in this research in terms of like how we captured the data, what the biases we were looking for are. And then if you might also talk about the A/B testing side of things and how do we bring that into the research equation?
Sure, yeah. So on the forensic side, basically what we're trying to do is capture the giving experience. So it's a very unique type of research. It's a mystery shopper type. So what we don't know, right, is those pages that we said were good or bad. We don't know what their actual metrics or rates are. They're not our clients. They didn't share their data with us. All we were doing is analyzing and scoring the front end giving experience. While we marked those things as good or bad, or we're able to give percentage grades, is we would attribute positive, negative points based on our research. So our research says when you require unnecessary form fields, you lose donors. Therefore, if you have required form fields, we will dock you 1 point, or you get 0 points for form field. If you don't have a value proposition at all, you get 0 points because there's no reason for me to give. Because we know in our research that if you have at least some copy, it's good. And if you have really good copy, like that Hillsdale example that I showed, you get a lot more donations. So then you'll get 3 points if you have a strong. So that's kind of how the scoring comes in. And it's like quasi-scientific, right? Of kind of, is it 3 points or is it 2? I don't know. We just kind of chose numbers, but we've used the same methodology now a few times. So when we did a research study in public radio and PBS, we're doing one globally. We've done one in higher ed. It's the same methodology. So you can argue whether the methodology is good or bad, but when we compare higher eds to other nonprofits, it's the same questions that we're answering. So that's really what we're trying to do, is codify and develop a benchmark on the user experience, which really doesn't exist. On the A/B testing side, that gets obviously super complicated very quick, but there's a bunch of different ways to test. But the only experiments that we show are ones that are statistically significant. So we use a 95% degree of confidence, or confidence level, to actually teach and train from. Which isn't to say you shouldn't trust or use experiments or examples that are maybe lower than that, but that's kind of the universally accepted level of significance to accept, to kind of be trustworthy. So that's when we show these examples, all of those have reached statistical significance. And if you want to know more about, do we use like the Bayesian technique and things like that, you can email us and we'll discuss how we actually evaluate and log those different experiments. But hopefully that helps.
Awesome. Thanks, Brady. I think that is helpful. Ricky, if you've got deeper questions, again, as Brady said, feel free to shoot us an email or drop something else in the chat if you want to go a little bit deeper, or if we didn't quite understand that question. Here's something from Gabby. When you're talking about different funds and, many of these experiences, there's like 1,000, literally 1,000 funds that you could choose from in some cases, and how to handle that. She's saying, for a closely affiliated audience of students and alumni who love an organization, do we see any value in having some of these fund options to make a gift more meaningful? And kind of a follow-up, she's wondering, is there an opportunity to bring personalization data to the table, maybe to make a specific fund ask or something like that? So any other thoughts around that? For either of you?
Brady, you can answer, but that was exactly the point I was making with this new feature. We actually worked with a really large nonprofit on this, where we wanted to contextualize it. What we found in my experience with supporting some organizations where there was a lot of support for people, sometimes you see a name like, John Smith or something like that. Well, is that the John Smith I know? Well, when I see his photo and I see that he's in Baton Rouge, Louisiana or whatever, I know that's the right person. So we didn't totally take all the friction away, but at least we took the anxiety away. And with some of the higher ed organizations that we work with, I mean, these guys have hundreds of designated funds. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And as you guys know, and I don't mean this to come across in the wrong ways, but a lot of times that's really for the organization's benefit. It's not necessarily for the donor's benefit, but they need them. And so we just accepted the reality that if they're going to be there, what could we do to improve that experience, to maybe take that heuristic that you showed and reduce a little bit of that anxiety?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think there's no way of getting around certain designated funds. I do think if you know that like 80% of people end up choosing, the scholarship fund, then for your general donation page, having that pre-selected makes a lot of sense, because you are kind of saying, this is what most people actually choose. So let's make it easier for most people. Making me go through a drop-down list with hundreds to figure out the John C, Betty, and Doug Fund or whatever it is, when you get like 2 online donations to that fund, but it's still equally weighted and it's in there with all the other funds. That's what we're saying we need to get
Brady,
away from.
Brady, one more quick point on that. One of the other things that we do that's unique, I mean, forgive me for peddling, is but we can contextualize it based upon the embed code so that only certain designated funds show up that are relative to that particular campaign or that geography or whatever it may be, because you may not need to see all 300 if you're given to a camp and it only applies to 10 people.
Right. And I should clarify, we made donations from the homepage, so we gave to the main general donation page. When we did the email analysis, we saw a lot more of specific asks to specific funds, and then we were pointed to a dedicated landing page that talked about that fund. That's how that should be done as well. If you're raising money for the alumni fund or COVID relief, then don't point me to a general donation page where I have to see nothing about COVID relief and then find the drop-down fund. Point me to a customized landing page that says, here's what we're doing to respond to COVID fund. We need your help. And then, give to that fund. So that is we did go from the main donation page, and that is more of the catch-all page. And to Ray's point, the optimal solution can't be 1,000 options of 2 non-contextual drop-down options. So I think that University of Wisconsin idea is a really good one of saying, here's kind of like the 3 most popular ones. And if you don't see what you're looking for, you can click other and then you can go through the myriad of drop downs, but forcing that on all users is not a good solution.
Awesome. Well, thank you to you both. Those are great answers, and hopefully that's helpful. One more question that we have, if there's any other questions that are out there, feel free to get them in quick. But the last question I have for now is from Nicole, and she's saying, at least at their organization, for non-alumni, she agrees with what the data is saying, that there's not enough emails being sent for non-alumni specifically. They probably need to ratchet that up. But for alumni specifically, they're hearing from a lot of people around the organization from different teams and different departments, and there can be like a lot of clutter. So any thoughts on how to navigate those multiple audiences and then having the one that's like, there's a lot of competition for having their ear?
Yeah, and that's another really good point. Again, limitation of this study is that we're not alumni, we're a general donor, and that's our experience. And we're benchmarking the general donor experience to higher ed versus the general donor experience to others, knowing that alumni is obviously one of the most unique types of things. What we've seen and what is the advantage that you have with alumni is there's an instant connection, and people in theory are receptive to know like what's going on at my school, like how are things going, whether it's like athletics or academics or things like that. And so what we've seen overall, but particularly in higher ed with our clients, is content. Delivering engaging, useful content is the best way to engage alumni and actually grow revenue. So when we showed some of those significant revenue growth charts, one of those organizations is higher ed. And what we've done is done things like free online courses, ebooks and downloads, focused a lot on blog and content. And then you issue those things to alumni because it's about delivering value. Even me as an alumni, I want to hear a little bit about what the school's doing, but I don't come online and like, please tell me what my alma mater is doing on campus. I want to know what's going on in the world. I want to know something beneficial to me. So it's taking that inbound marketing kind of lens and going out to your alumni that we've seen work really, really well. And then the more that they open, click, and engage, when it comes time to do the alumni drive or the renewal or the giving day, you've got an open, engaged audience, and it's going to be a lot easier to actually raise money from them in that way. So I think there's a lot more emails I know that go out in alumni, but I think the strategy of kind of cultivation content really to engage is fairly universal, even in a high value segment like alumni.
Great, thank you so much. That is the end of our questions. So I guess I'll throw it back to both of you for any parting words of encouragement. Ray, any words of encouragement from you as people try to figure out how do I take this research and this data and move forward?
Well, no, I think from working with you guys in the past, I think obviously it is overwhelming when you see it all together, but the kind of information you guys are sharing and the findings I think that we found through the study, you can do it in bite sizes. There is some incremental improvement to take it a step at a time. And so I think Brady could probably jump on that, but you don't feel like you have to do everything at one time.
No, I think that's a really, really good point. We should make that clear too. It's not going from 0 to 60. It's how do you have less friction? How do you have more value proposition? How do you take some of these concepts and just do them a little bit better? And obviously test and optimize. I think the thing that's encouraging for me at least is even in the past kind of 6 months for the people that I know in higher ed and the conversations, there seems to be a lot more willingness, and I don't know if this is related to COVID or not, that has pushed people more online and made people be more digital or realize we can't do our alumni events like we used to, that there has been a renewed increase on the online experience, knowing that higher eds could kind of get away with a pretty bad experience because of high motivation alumni, but it's at the cost of a lot of lower to medium motivation alumni. And I think maybe they're seeing that or feeling that or seeing the opportunity. So I've been more encouraged just from what I've seen, even going through the study from the beginning to the end, in terms of how people are responding to COVID and maybe adapting or upgrading or updating their strategies. So I think there is hope. There's a lot of room to improve, obviously, as we've seen. But I do think, yeah, the bite-sized thing, like Ray said, and there is, you know, a seemingly more willingness to actually try some of those things, which would be great.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your time and for your insights, and for Brady for unpacking all of that research. I know there's comments coming in, just grateful for the time and for the thought. So thank you all of you for listening and watching today. Again, we'll wrap this up. We'll grab a recording and I'll send it out to you this evening. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. Take care, and we will see you on the next webinar. Bye-bye.